We're working very diligently with Europe, the EU, which covers a lot of territory, a lot of countries. But we haven't really. We don't have a deal with Canada. We haven't been focused on it.
Just days before his self-imposed August 1st deadline, President Donald Trump said it out loud. The U.S. hasn't really been focused on Canada and might not even reach a trade deal. It wasn't just a shrug, it was a statement of disregard. In the middle of high-stakes negotiations, Trump dismissed America's largest trading partner as an afterthought. He hinted Canada could simply pay the tariffs with no real negotiation. To many in Ottawa, this wasn't a threat, it was a signal. Because unlike his approach with Japan or the UK, where pressure was carefully escalated, this moment revealed something else: impatience. And that impatience may have just handed Canada a strategic edge.
Yeah, and the first thing everyone needs to do is exhale, because what the president just said there actually lines up very consistently with what we heard from Canada's negotiators on this.
For weeks, the Canadian government has worked to manage public expectations. Prime Minister Mark Carney, Minister Dominic LeBlanc, and Ambassador Kirsten Hillman have all echoed one message: Canada won't rush into a bad deal. Trump's public remarks ended up confirming that very narrative. When the U.S. president openly admitted a deal may not happen, he gave Canada cover. Now, if talks break down, Ottawa won't take the blame, because Washington walked away first. It's a rare case where silence from Canada was matched by a loud concession from the other side. For Ottawa, that's a communications victory, even without a signed agreement. Trump's comments also put his own trade team in a difficult position. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer have been actively engaging with Canada, describing talks as constructive and productive. LeBlanc has spent days in Washington, meeting with senators and senior officials. Yet, as his own officials were making progress, Trump sent a different message to the world. Negotiations might not matter at all. This internal contradiction weakens the American position. It allows Canadian officials to question who holds the real authority and to slow-walk discussions until a coherent U.S. stance emerges. The more fractured the American message, the more leverage Canada gains. But perhaps the biggest consequence of Trump's remarks won't be felt this week. It'll come in 2026. Under the terms of the USMCA, the agreement must undergo a mandatory review that begins with a Free Trade Commission meeting, expected by late 2025. Trump's team has already signaled plans to use that review to push for stricter origin rules, immigration clauses, and supply chain controls. However, if the U.S. imposes 35% tariffs on Canada now without achieving a negotiated outcome, that strategy may backfire. Canada and Mexico will be able to argue that tariffs have already failed as leverage. Worse, Trump may find himself entering the 2026 review with less credibility and fewer tools. Meanwhile, Canada is preparing its own parallel track, a proposed security and economic agreement to solidify its defense commitments and regional cooperation. That deal, still in early stages, could give Ottawa a new foundation for talks and weaken Trump's ability to dominate the agenda. What looked like a warning may actually be a leak. Trump likely believed he was turning up the pressure. But by speaking too soon and undercutting his own negotiators, he exposed the cracks in his trade strategy. He gave Canada a narrative it can control, a pace it can set, and a reason to delay until the balance shifts. There's still time for a deal, but if there isn't one, it won't just be Canada that pays the price. Trump's own credibility, heading into 2026, may be what gets taxed next.
U.S. President Donald Trump showing no signs of backing down from his tariff agenda, as old complaints about Canada surface again, adding to the already tense relationship. Still, the Trump administration insists this is not the end of free trade with its neighbors.
When U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said that free trade with Canada is still possible, many were surprised. After months of tariff threats, some reaching 35%, the tone suddenly seemed less absolute. But the question isn't whether Trump changed his mind. It's why. Something clearly shifted behind closed doors. Because even as Trump keeps the pressure high, Ottawa may be holding a card that Washington can't afford to lose. That card. Canada's role in energy, and more specifically, uranium.
The largest uranium mine comes out of Saskatchewan, comes over to Ontario, and then gets enriched down in the U.S.
Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft are all betting on nuclear energy to power their AI data center.
From California to Virginia, tech giants like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft are expanding massive data centers. And all of them have one thing in common. They demand enormous amounts of electricity, clean, constant, and carbon-free. Nuclear power, once overlooked, is now back in the spotlight. And uranium, its essential fuel, is in short supply. The U.S. has tried to revive domestic uranium production. In 2024, the U.S. mined only 676,939 pounds, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That's less than 1.5% of the roughly 48 million pounds America currently needs each year. And the gap is only growing. Trump's own executive orders target 190 million pounds per year by 2050 as nuclear power quadruples to meet energy demand. But there's a problem. America now imports over 95% of its uranium. And the infrastructure for enrichment and processing is still dominated by Russia and China, two geopolitical rivals. That's why Canada's uranium supply is vital. The Cigar Lake mine in Saskatchewan, operated by Cameco, produces 11% of global uranium demand, and a significant, though undisclosed, portion heads directly into the U.S. nuclear fuel cycle. If Canada brings that leverage to the negotiating table, it could change everything. And uranium is just the beginning. Because beyond nuclear fuel, Canada also powers America through oil, gas, and electricity, resources equally hard to replace. Canada isn't just waiting for Trump's phone call, it's already shifting its energy exports away from the U.S. In July 2025, Canada shipped its first liquefied natural gas, LNG cargo, to South Korea from the massive LNG Canada terminal in British Columbia. With more LNG projects under development, like Cedar LNG and Woodfibre LNG, Canada is building new energy corridors to Asia. Meanwhile, uranium exports to the European Union are surging. France's EDF signed long-term contracts for Canadian uranium to help reduce EU dependence on Russian energy. And in this broader strategy, Trump's tariffs have ironically accelerated Canada's diversification. By turning to Asia and Europe, Ottawa has reduced its reliance on American buyers and increased its leverage in return. Of course, the US has other energy suppliers. Australia, for example, ships uranium to American utilities. But even that relationship is under strain. Trade tensions, especially over pharmaceutical pricing and rare earths, have begun to affect broader economic ties. Other past suppliers, like Russia and Belarus, are either sanctioned or politically untenable. What's left is a short list, and Canada is at the top. Not just for uranium, but also for nickel, aluminum, auto parts, and crude oil. Ontario alone holds the world's most accessible reserves of high-grade nickel, which is critical for electric vehicles, defense systems, and AI servers. With supply chains so closely tied, the message is hard to miss. The two economies are simply too integrated to pull apart.
Donald Trump has announced that he wants a golden age for the American economy. That means they're going to need more energy, more minerals, more steel and aluminum, more lumber, more concrete, more of the things that Canada is already sending them.
Uranium, and energy more broadly, isn't just a Canadian export, it's leverage. In a negotiation driven by tariffs and tension, it might be the key to securing a deal with Trump. That's why, despite all the pressure and posturing, a partial deal before August 1st remains on the table. Canada may agree to some targeted tariffs on autos or steel, but only if its core energy exports remain protected. Because in the end, this isn't just a trade fight. It's a test of how two deeply linked economies find balance in an era of brinkmanship.
De Silva that Brazil will respond in kind with its own tariffs if the U.S. goes through what it wants to do by August 1. Your thought?
President Donald Trump's second-term trade doctrine has entered a volatile phase. In recent weeks, the administration has issued formal notices to a string of trade partners. 35% tariffs on Canada, 30% on Mexico, 50% on Brazil. These aren't just economic decisions. They are calculated power plays, and the world is responding. Rather than strengthening American leverage, Trump's tariff blitz is hardening resistance. Countries that once depended on U.S. trade are now coordinating responses, and in some cases, turning away altogether.
We both agree that it is essential to respect the USMCA trade agreements, and we shared our experiences about the letter we received from President Trump.
One of the clearest signs that Trump's pressure is backfiring came this week, when Canada and Mexico publicly pledged to strengthen bilateral trade. Both countries confirmed they had received tariff letters from the U.S., 35% for Canada, 30% for Mexico, set to take effect August 1st if negotiations fail. In response, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum agreed to deepen economic cooperation. Carney is expected to visit Mexico in the coming weeks to formalize joint strategies. For two neighbors long tied to the U.S. through the USMCA, this pivot marks a significant realignment. Rather than fracture, Trump's tariff threats are pushing America's closest allies to close ranks, without the U.S.
Consider that maybe for the last 50 years, we are going through the worst moment in the relation between Brazil and Washington.
Tensions are even sharper further south. Brazil was hit with the steepest tariff, 50% on all exports to the U.S., up from 10% announced in April. Trump framed the move as retaliation for what he called political persecution of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who faces charges for his role in the January 2023 coup attempt. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva rejected the move as an act of political interference. His administration immediately activated a new fast response tariff mechanism, authorizing counter tariffs against U.S. goods. According to Brazil's Ministry of Development, only 12% of Brazilian exports are destined for the U.S., allowing the country to redirect trade with minimal disruption. The sectors affected include oil, orange juice, coffee, and steel. While the economic exposure is manageable, the diplomatic damage is real. Lula has publicly signaled a shift toward deeper ties with BRICS nations and Asian partners, a trend accelerated by Trump's moves.
This is unilateralism, and it's highly personalistic. It's President Trump because he doesn't like somebody. And, and I think it has very severe implications for U.S. relations with Latin America.
The ripple effects go beyond Brazil. In Colombia, relations have deteriorated rapidly after allegations emerged linking U.S. figures to an attempted political plot. Trump responded by recalling the U.S. ambassador and threatening to revoke Colombia's drug cooperation certification, a move that could cut vital aid. But instead of backing down, President Gustavo Petro has pushed back. His administration is now exploring deeper ties with BRICS institutions, including development financing outside the U.S. orbit. Across Latin America, a quiet realignment is underway. Countries are looking to diversify trade, reduce political exposure, and limit dependency on Washington. Trump's aggressive stance may be aimed at asserting dominance, but the region's reaction suggests it's having the opposite effect.
I mean, is it a political failure for the Prime Minister if Canada ends up with some level of tariffs at the end of this, or is it just the reality of dealing with Donald Trump?
What began as a strategy to strengthen U.S. leverage is now showing signs of unraveling. Rather than forcing deals on America's terms, the tariff campaign is driving partners together and away from Washington's orbit. Canada is no longer negotiating alone. Mexico is no longer avoiding alignment. Brazil, once neutral, is openly confronting U.S. influence. And in Europe, even close allies are preparing for long-term trade diversification. For the Trump administration, the short-term political optics may still resonate with parts of the domestic base. But the long-term cost is rising. Fractured trust, declining diplomatic capital, and global supply chains that are learning to work around, not through, the United States. The real impact of these tariffs may not be in what they tax. It may be in what they break.